Hey, Lisa, how you guys doing? It's good to be back. Surgery went well. Um, Knees in a little bit of pain, but here I am. Um, so, quick joke. Hey, why is there music coming from the printer? I guess the paper must be jamming. Okay. Anyway, so here's what we got today. So first off, just curricular wise, continuing on with this idea of the Gilded Age. So next is Andrew Carnegie. So there's a YouTube video that talks about how Andrew Carnegie made his wealth. A little bit of a screencast. Some notes on Andrew Carnegie. It's a fascinating story, rags to riches, the American dream, right? That we can arrive here with nothing. He came as an immigrant. Um, Family, as well, he came as a child with parents who immigrated, and went from absolutely nothing to, at his death, the richest guy like in the United States. So yeah, there's that. So there's that story. But in addition, be remiss if we didn't talk about what the heck is going on in our country right now. So your Due Now has an article, actually an editorial that appeared in the New York Times a couple of days ago about qualified immunity for police officers, which is an issue which is at the heart of a lot of these issues we're having with policing. And qualified immunity is something that is controversial. It's been controversial for quite some time. Um, and it is the answer as to why justice is often not achieved for members of minority communities who feel like, the victims of police over policing. So read that editorial. There's some questions that kind of go along with it. I think that'll give you some good legal perspective onto what, some things, some changes, because there's been some talk in Congress about changing this. So maybe that will move the ball down the field a little bit there. Um, the other thing is just the lessons from history for this, right? So I think, what we've been talking about here in US 1, this issue of race, and in particular, race as remember that article that you've read, back when we were talking about slavery as, this idea of a social control, and that this is a completely arbitrary thing, and how this kind of created, and how race-based laws started in the United States, right? And how racism then became ingrained into our system, institutionalized. So we've talked. So you have that kind of a context. That's something we've actually talked about already in class. But the other thing, so history teaches us that this is a long, deeply rooted problem for this country. The other lesson from history is that our country is strong, and our country perseveres, and our country withstands these terrible, terrible tests. So also think about what we've talked about here in US 1. Like we just finished talking about the Civil War. There's nothing more traumatic for a country in which 3% of the population is killed or maimed in a fight between brother and brother. And again, race is a central argument in that, and that our country emerges out of that Civil War into a period now where we're starting to look at this Gilded Age of huge economic growth, and we're seeing there. So our country can arise stronger out of this, right? And out of the Civil War, out of that horror and bloodshed, you get the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, those promises, which aren't completely fulfilled, and we're still trying to fulfill them. So again, our history tells us a couple of different things here. One, that we are strong people, and that our country will survive this. But it's what our country will be after we, right? Will we take from this something, and move the country further, getting to that idea of trying to create that more perfect union, right? That Lincoln talked about in his Gettysburg Address. So there's a lot of lessons here with US 1 that we've been talking about that our country still needs to learn, and this is kind of why we study these things, to help us in these times of great strife. Anywho, so I hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and talk to you guys later. So today we're going to talk about Andrew Carnegie, and what I have for you as well is this short video with notes, as well as a longer video from YouTube for you to watch to get more background on Carnegie. But this was just to fill in some of the things that aren't necessarily in that video. So Carnegie is going to rise to be one of the richest men ever in American history. And at one point, he was the richest man in American history. And his wealth will come from steel. So Carnegie's story is that he's an immigrant. So he comes as a child from Scotland, and he is poor. He, as a kid, he can't afford to stay in school. His family needs him to work, so he gets a job working in a bobbin factory, basically doing menial work. Eventually, he gets a job working for a telegraph company, running messages across Pittsburgh, and then eventually from that gets a job working at the Pennsylvania Railroad. And in working at the Pennsylvania Railroad, he then impresses people with his business acumen. He actually comes up with some brilliant ideas on how to revolutionize the railroad industry. So, for example, it is Carnegie who says that, hey, maybe we should run our trains 24/7. And the thought then, if your trains are running at night, you need sleeping cars where people can sleep. The thought was that Pittsburgh was the industrial capital of the United States, but that New York was the financial capital of the United States. So you had business people who need to go between Pittsburgh and New York. And so the thought was if you had cars that sleeping cars and trains that ran at night, you can now run a red eye. And so the thought being is that people could sleep at night on the train, wake up in New York, and not lose a day of work. In addition, it is Carnegie who comes up with the idea of discounts for frequent trips. So if your family commutes into the city, I'm sure they don't pay per trip. Instead, what they do is they buy a monthly pass or a yearly pass. And of course, the monthly pass and the yearly pass comes at a discount. And what's great for the railroad company is that they get that money up front. So that's a guaranteed income for them. Why it's great for the consumers because it comes at a discount. You just have to make sure you use it enough times to actually get your money's worth. And some people don't. And so that's another benefit for the railroad company. From there, he begins investing. He's taught about stocks and investments while working at the railroad, and then realizes that it's time maybe to start making an investment of his own. And he leaves the railroad and buys a Bessemer factory making steel. And his motto is watch the costs and the profits will take care of themselves. Carnegie is famous for knowing how much it costs to make a ton of his product down to the penny. As a result of knowing his costs right down to the penny, he also knows the costs of his competitors, which means he knows how low he can charge his price or how high he can charge his price and still undercut his opponents or his competitors, which gave him a distinct advantage. So if he knew that he could, that his competitor was selling, it cost them $30 to make a ton of steel. If Carnegie can find a way to charge under $30 and still make a profit, he could drive his competitors out of business. And this was some of his business acumen and business tactics. Also, he employed something called vertical consolidation. And vertical consolidation is owning all the processes or all the parts of a process. So, for example, if you think about it in terms of steel, and so with vertical consolidation, he owns all the steps necessary to make steel. So he controls the entire process by owning all the ingredients. So if you think of it in terms of a recipe, you're going to make chocolate chip cookies. And so if you're going to make chocolate chip cookies, you have to go out and buy all the ingredients. Of course, when you go to Stop and Shop to buy the ingredients, Stop and Shop is going to charge a little bit more to make a profit, which means your costs go up. But imagine if you were going to make a whole bunch of chocolate chip cookies, but you owned a chocolate factory, or you owned a flour mill, or you owned a dairy to make butter and milk, things like that. And if you owned all the process of, you owned all those ingredients, well, you don't have to buy them from yourself, which means your costs then go down because you get them at cost, which means your profits will then increase. Okay, and of course, he's doing this when his competitors are not. So when he's making steel, he invests in every part of the process. So steel comes from the ground, it comes from iron ore, which is in the ground. So he owns a mine to find that iron ore. You then have to melt down that iron ore. To do that, you need You need ash that comes from coal, which means you need a coal mine to do this. He owned a coal mine. Then you need a factory, to kind of do all this. So he owned an iron factory to make all this stuff, right? Then you need a transportation network, a way to get your iron to the consumers, right? And then you have, a wholesale type of business where you basically are selling it to the that way you have a series of stores. And so by having controlling all these steps in the process, he doesn't have to pay anyone for anything, and he makes every penny that he possibly could make. And so as a result, he builds the world's largest company at the time, 20,000 workers. He will become very, very rich. He will donate $350 million in his lifetime. And so if you think about this is, of course, 1890s types of dollars. So if you want to figure out what that is today, usually a quick, rough way to do it is to add a zero, right? So he's giving away basically $3.5 billion in his lifetime. And he gives all of his money away and he leaves nothing to his family. And he had a family. And he writes something called the Gospel of Wealth. And the Gospel of Wealth basically says that it is the best thing one can do with their money is to basically give it back to society. So money came from society, it should go back to society. And so he didn't leave his money to his kids. Instead, he gave it away. And his kids' job, he didn't give his kids a job. Their job was to give his money away. Carnegie gets out of the steel business by selling his company to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was his chief competitor once you got into the early 1900s. J.P. Morgan was trying to beat Carnegie, couldn't figure out how to do it. So instead, he offers to buy him out. And at that moment, where he pays roughly $500 million for Carnegie Steel, again, add a zero, so we're talking almost $5 billion, Carnegie becomes the richest man on the planet.